Tonight, we journey into one of history's darkest chapters, a time when death arrived not with armies or earthquakes, but with something far more terrifying: silence. The silence of deserted villages, abandoned fields, and streets where grass pushed through the cracks of forgotten stone, because there was no one left to walk upon them. We are exploring the Black Death, a plague that didn't merely kill, but erased civilizations, rewrote the map of humanity, and scarred our collective memory in ways that still echo today. This was no ordinary epidemic. It was an apocalypse that crept across continents in slow motion, leaving behind a world so transformed that nothing would ever be the same again. Between 1330 and 1353, an invisible killer swept through Asia, Africa, and Europe, cutting the global population from roughly 475 million to around 350 million. These aren't just numbers. They are vanished bloodlines, silenced languages, and abandoned cities that had stood for centuries. So, dim the lights. Let the room grow quiet. And together, let's step back into a time when humanity stood on the edge of extinction. A stark reminder of how fragile our world truly is, and how quickly everything we take for granted can fade into the darkness. Picture this. You're living in the year 1347, and rumors are spreading faster than wildfire through the trading posts and merchant routes of Europe. Strange stories from the East, tales of entire cities falling silent, of ships arriving in ports with no living crew, of a sickness so terrible that it could kill a healthy person in days. But these aren't just rumors. They're warnings of something that had already been carving a path of destruction across the known world for over a decade. The plague, what we now call the Black Death, didn't announce itself with trumpets or declarations of war. It crept across continents like a shadow, leaving behind a trail of empty homes and unmarked graves. The disease that would reshape human civilization was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, though the people of the 14th century had no understanding of bacteria, germs, or the microscopic world that surrounded them. To them, this was divine punishment, demonic possession, or perhaps the end of the world itself. They were wrong about the cause, but they weren't wrong about the scale of the catastrophe. Yersinia pestis is a master of disguise and adaptation. It can survive in multiple hosts, spread through various methods, and mutate in ways that make it incredibly difficult to combat. The bacterium primarily lives in rodents, rats, mice, squirrels, and other small mammals, but it's the fleas that feed on these animals that serve as the delivery system for death. When an infected flea bites a rodent, the bacteria multiply so rapidly in the flea's digestive system that they actually block the insect's stomach. This creates a biological nightmare. The flea becomes desperately hungry, but can't properly digest food, so it bites again and again, regurgitating infected blood into each new wound, spreading the plague with every desperate attempt to feed. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. When the rodent population dies off, and plague kills rats just as efficiently as it kills humans, the fleas don't simply die with their hosts. They jump ship, seeking new sources of blood. And in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities, the most available alternative hosts were humans. The plague manifested in 3 primary forms, each more horrifying than the last. Bubonic plague, the most common form, attacked the lymphatic system. Victims would develop massive, painful swellings called buboes in their groin, armpits, and neck, black, festering lumps that could grow to the size of apples. The pain was excruciating, and the mortality rate was between 30 and 75%. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, turning the victim's breath into a weapon. This form could spread directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing, making it incredibly contagious. Victims would cough up blood and die within days, their lungs literally drowning in infected fluid. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague was nearly 100%. The third form, septicemic plague, was perhaps the most terrifying of all. The bacteria would enter the bloodstream directly, causing massive internal bleeding and organ failure. Victims would develop dark patches on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface, giving them a blackened appearance that may have contributed to the disease's name. Death came quickly, often within hours, and the mortality rate was virtually 100%. What made the Black Death so devastating wasn't just its lethality, it was its unpredictability. The disease could remain dormant in animal populations for years, then suddenly explode into human communities with devastating effect. It could spread through trade routes, following merchants and travelers across vast distances. It could lie hidden in cargo, in clothing, in the very goods that connected the medieval world. The plague's journey to Europe began much earlier than most people realize. The first recorded outbreak occurred in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia in the early 1300s, where it had been circulating among local rodent populations for centuries. From there, it spread along the Silk Road, that great network of trade routes that connected east and west. By 1330, the plague had reached China, where it devastated the population and contributed to the fall of the Yuan dynasty. Contemporary Chinese records describe cities where the living could barely bury the dead, where entire families would disappear overnight, where the streets were littered with corpses that no one dared to touch. The disease then spread westward, following the trade routes through Central Asia and into the Middle East. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where it would make the leap that would change European history forever. At the trading post of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, the plague encountered something that would accelerate its spread beyond anything seen before: maritime trade. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, a bustling port where merchants from across the known world came to exchange goods. It was also under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. When plague broke out among the Mongol forces, it should have ended the siege. Instead, it became the launching point for one of history's most devastating biological attacks. According to the chronicler Gabriel de Mussis, the Mongols used catapults to hurl plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa, deliberately spreading the disease among the defenders. Whether this account is entirely accurate or not, the result was undeniable. The plague took hold in Kaffa, and from there it boarded ships bound for Europe. In October of 1347, 12 ships limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. Those who eagerly approached were met with a sight that would haunt Europe for generations. Almost all aboard were either dead or barely alive, their skin erupting with blackened boils that dripped blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, horrified by what they saw, demanded the ships set sail immediately, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The Black Death was now in Europe, and millions would die in what would become one of the greatest disasters in human history. The plague had found its way into the heart of medieval civilization, and nothing would ever be the same again. The ships that brought death to Europe weren't just carrying infected sailors, they were carrying infected rats and fleas. As the vessels docked in ports across the Mediterranean, these tiny stowaways disembarked along with the cargo, spreading into the urban environments that would become perfect breeding grounds for the plague. Medieval cities were, by modern standards, incredibly unsanitary. Waste management was primitive at best, with human and animal refuse often dumped directly into streets or nearby waterways. Buildings were crowded together, with multiple families sharing small spaces. The rat population thrived in these conditions, and where rats went, fleas followed. The timing of the plague's arrival in Europe couldn't have been worse. The continent was already weakened by a series of disasters that historians call the crisis of the 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had killed millions and left the surviving population malnourished and vulnerable to disease. Climate change, a cooling period known as the Little Ice Age, had disrupted agriculture and led to widespread social unrest. Political instability was rampant. The 100 Years' War between England and France had begun in 1337, draining resources and disrupting trade. The Catholic Church was in crisis, with competing popes claiming authority in what would become known as the Western Schism. Social tensions were rising as the feudal system began to break down under economic pressure. Into this weakened, chaotic world came a disease that seemed designed to exploit every vulnerability of medieval society. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed rich and poor, young and old, clergy and laity, with equal efficiency. But it thrived in the conditions that medieval life provided: crowded cities, poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and extensive trade networks that could carry the disease across vast distances in a matter of weeks. The Black Death wasn't just a medical catastrophe. It was a perfect storm of biological, social, and environmental factors that created the conditions for one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. And as those 12 ships sat in the harbor of Messina, their deadly cargo already spreading into the city, Europe stood on the brink of an apocalypse that would reshape the continent forever. The silence that would soon fall over much of the known world was about to begin. Villages would empty, cities would become graveyards, and entire regions would return to wilderness as the plague carved its way through human civilization like a scythe through wheat. The Black Death had arrived, and the world would never be the same. To understand how the Black Death could kill so many people so quickly, we need to descend into the microscopic world of Yersinia pestis and witness the biological machinery of mass destruction. This wasn't just a disease, it was evolution's perfect killer, refined over millennia to exploit the weaknesses of mammalian immune systems with terrifying efficiency. Yersinia pestis is a gram-negative bacterium that belongs to the same family as the organisms that cause typhoid and dysentery. But unlike its relatives, Y. pestis has evolved specific adaptations that make it uniquely deadly. The bacterium can survive in temperatures ranging from near freezing to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, allowing it to persist in diverse climates and conditions. The plague bacterium's life cycle is a masterpiece of biological horror. It begins in the gut of a flea, where the bacteria multiply so rapidly that they form what scientists call a biofilm, essentially a living plug that blocks the flea's digestive system. This blockage creates a feedback loop of infection. The flea becomes desperately hungry but can't properly digest blood, so it feeds more frequently and regurgitates infected material into each new bite wound. When Y. pestis enters a human host, it immediately begins to subvert the body's immune system. The bacterium produces a protein called the V antigen, which interferes with the host's ability to mount an effective immune response. It's like a biological stealth system that allows the plague to establish itself before the body even realizes it's under attack. The bacteria then begin to multiply at an exponential rate. In bubonic plague, they concentrate in the lymph nodes, those small organs that normally filter out harmful substances from the body's fluids. The lymph nodes become overwhelmed, swelling into the characteristic buboes that gave the bubonic plague its name. These swellings aren't just painful, they're visible evidence of the body's immune system being overrun. But the plague doesn't stop there. As the bacteria continue to multiply, they begin to produce toxins that damage blood vessels and organs throughout the body. The victim's temperature spikes as the immune system desperately tries to fight off the infection. Delirium sets in as toxins affect the brain. The cardiovascular system begins to fail as blood vessels become damaged and leaky. In pneumonic plague, the bacteria attack the lungs directly, causing massive inflammation and fluid buildup. Victims literally drown in their own infected fluids, coughing up blood and infectious droplets that can spread the disease to anyone nearby. The speed of pneumonic plague is terrifying. Victims can go from healthy to dead in as little as 24 hours. Septicemic plague is perhaps the most horrifying form because it attacks the bloodstream directly. The bacteria multiply so rapidly in the blood that they overwhelm the body's ability to fight back. Toxins cause massive internal bleeding, and the victim's skin takes on a blackened appearance as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. Death comes quickly, often before the characteristic buboes have time to form. What made the Black Death so devastating wasn't just the lethality of individual cases. It was the disease's ability to spread through multiple pathways simultaneously. Bubonic plague spread through flea bites. Pneumonic plague spread through respiratory droplets, and septicemic plague could develop from either of the other forms. This created a multi-vector pandemic that was virtually impossible to contain with medieval medical knowledge. The medieval understanding of disease was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this system, illness resulted from an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and treatment involved restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, or dietary changes. This approach was not only useless against plague, it was often counterproductive, weakening patients when they needed all their strength to fight the infection. Medieval physicians had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or the germ theory of disease. They believed that plague was caused by miasma, bad air or noxious vapors that arose from rotting organic matter. This led to treatments that focused on purifying the air with herbs, spices, and aromatic substances, while ignoring the actual vectors of transmission, fleas, and infected droplets. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that plague victims were essentially left to fight the disease with their own immune systems. For bubonic plague, this meant a mortality rate of 30 to 75%, depending on the victim's age, health, and access to basic care. For pneumonic and septicemic plague, survival was virtually impossible without modern antibiotics. But the Black Death's impact went far beyond individual mortality rates. The disease struck communities with such speed and intensity that social structures began to collapse. In many areas, so many people died so quickly that the living couldn't bury the dead. Bodies piled up in streets, homes, and churches, creating perfect breeding grounds for the very rats and fleas that spread the disease. The plague also had a devastating impact on agriculture. Medieval society was overwhelmingly rural, with roughly 90% of the population engaged in farming. When plague struck rural communities, entire villages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Fields went unharvested, livestock died from neglect, and the food supply chain that supported urban populations began to break down. The speed of the plague's spread was accelerated by the very features of medieval life that had made European civilization possible. Trade routes that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange now became highways for death. Cities that had grown wealthy through commerce became death traps, where the disease could spread rapidly through crowded populations. Religious practices that had provided comfort and community became vectors for transmission. Churches where people gathered for worship became sites of mass infection. Pilgrimages that had been expressions of faith became journeys of death, spreading plague from community to community across vast distances. The plague's impact on different age groups was particularly devastating for society's future. While the disease killed people of all ages, it was especially lethal to children and young adults, the very people who represented the next generation. In some communities, entire age cohorts were wiped out, creating demographic gaps that would affect society for generations. The psychological impact of the plague was as devastating as its physical effects. People watched helplessly as family members, friends, and neighbors died horrible deaths. The randomness of the disease. Why did some people survive while others died? Challenged fundamental beliefs about divine justice and the nature of God. Many survivors suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. The Black Death also revealed the limitations of medieval medical knowledge in the starkest possible terms. Physicians, who were supposed to be healers, died at the same rate as their patients. Treatments that had been used for centuries proved utterly useless against this new threat. The very foundations of medical authority crumbled as it became clear that learned doctors knew no more about fighting the plague than common peasants. This medical helplessness led to a crisis of faith in established authorities. If physicians couldn't heal the sick, if priests couldn't protect their flocks, if kings couldn't defend their subjects, then what was the point of these traditional hierarchies? The plague didn't just kill people, it killed confidence in the institutions that had structured medieval society. The disease also created a feedback loop of social breakdown. As communities lost large portions of their population, the survivors often fled to other areas, carrying the plague with them. This created a pattern of abandonment and reinfection that could devastate entire regions. Some areas were hit by multiple waves of plague, preventing any possibility of recovery. The Black Death's biological mechanisms were perfectly suited to exploit the vulnerabilities of 14th century society. The disease was deadly enough to kill quickly, contagious enough to spread rapidly, and persistent enough to maintain itself in animal populations between outbreaks. It was, in essence, the perfect pandemic pathogen, unleashed on a world that had no defenses against it. As we'll see in the coming chapters, the Black Death didn't just kill people. It transformed the very nature of human civilization. The biological catastrophe that began with a few infected fleas would reshape politics, economics, religion, and culture in ways that are still felt today. The anatomy of this apocalypse reveals not just how a disease can kill, but how it can change the world forever. Long before the Black Death reached Europe, it had already carved a path of destruction across Asia that would make the European outbreak seem almost modest by comparison. The plague's journey westward followed the ancient trade routes that had connected east and west for over a millennium, transforming the Silk Road from a highway of commerce into a corridor of death. The story begins in the remote mountains of Central Asia, in a region that is now part of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Here, in the Tian Shan mountain range, Yersinia pestis had been circulating among local rodent populations for centuries, perhaps millennia. The bacterium lived in a delicate balance with its hosts, marmots, ground squirrels, and other burrowing mammals that thrived in the high-altitude grasslands. This natural reservoir of plague was like a biological time bomb, waiting for the right conditions to explode into human populations. Those conditions arrived in the early 14th century, when a combination of climate change, human expansion, and increased trade activity disturbed the ancient equilibrium between the plague bacterium and its animal hosts. The first recorded outbreak of what would become the Black Death pandemic occurred around 1338 in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological evidence from Nestorian Christian cemeteries in the area shows a sudden spike in deaths during this period, with inscriptions specifically mentioning pestilence as the cause of death. From this epicenter, the plague began to spread along the trade routes that crisscrossed Central Asia. The Silk Road wasn't a single path, but a network of interconnected routes that carried goods, ideas, and now disease across the vast expanse of the Eurasian continent. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and diplomats all became unwitting carriers of death as they traveled between the great cities of Asia. The plague's first major urban victim was the city of Samarkand, one of the great trading centers of Central Asia. Contemporary accounts describe a city where the living could barely bury the dead, where entire neighborhoods fell silent, and where the famous bazaars that had made the city wealthy stood empty and abandoned. From Samarkand, the plague spread in multiple directions simultaneously. One branch followed the northern route toward the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled much of what is now Russia and Eastern Europe. Another branch moved south toward India, where it would devastate the Delhi Sultanate and contribute to political upheaval that would last for decades. But it was the westward spread of the plague that would have the most dramatic impact on world history. The disease followed the main Silk Road routes through Persia, reaching the great cities of Isfahan, Tabriz, and Baghdad by 1347. Each urban center became a new epicenter of infection, spreading the plague to surrounding rural areas and launching it further along the trade networks. The impact on the Islamic world was catastrophic. The great historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the late 14th century, described the plague's effects on North Africa and the Middle East. Civilization both in the East and the West was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. In Egypt, the plague arrived in 1347 and killed an estimated one-third of the population. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had been one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, was severely weakened by the demographic catastrophe. Contemporary accounts describe Cairo as a city of the dead, where entire districts were abandoned and wild animals roamed through empty streets. The plague's impact on the Islamic world was particularly devastating because of the religion's emphasis on community worship and social solidarity. The 5 daily prayers, which brought people together in mosques, became opportunities for the disease to spread. The Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, which drew Muslims from across the known world, became a vector for transmitting plague across vast distances. Islamic medical knowledge, which had been far more advanced than European medicine, proved just as helpless against the plague. The great physician Ibn al-Khatib, working in Granada, was one of the first to suggest that the plague might be contagious, writing, "The existence of contagion is established by experience, research, the evidence of the senses, and trustworthy reports. But even this insight couldn't provide effective treatments for the disease. The plague's journey through Asia also revealed the interconnected nature of the medieval world economy. When the disease struck the great trading cities of Central Asia, it disrupted commerce across the entire Eurasian continent. Silk production in China declined dramatically as workers died or fled. Spice routes from India were interrupted as ports and trading posts were abandoned. The flow of silver from European mines to Asian markets slowed to a trickle as demand collapsed. In China, the plague contributed to the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-ruled empire that had controlled the country since the 13th century. The disease arrived in China around 1333 and spread rapidly through the densely populated river valleys of the south. Contemporary Chinese sources describe scenes of unimaginable horror, cities where corpses floated down rivers, villages where not a single person survived, and entire provinces that returned to wilderness. The demographic impact on China was staggering. Some estimates suggest that the population fell from around 120 million to 65 million between 1300 and 1400, a decline of nearly 50%. This catastrophic population loss contributed to social unrest, economic collapse, and ultimately the overthrow of Mongol rule by the native Ming dynasty in 1368. The plague's spread through Asia also demonstrated the disease's ability to adapt to different climates and environments. In the cold steppes of Central Asia, it survived in marmot populations. In the hot, humid climate of India, it found new hosts among urban rat populations. In the arid regions of the Middle East, it persisted in the fleas and rodents that lived in grain stores and warehouses. This adaptability made the plague virtually impossible to contain using medieval methods. Quarantine measures, which had some success in later European outbreaks, were largely unknown in Asia during the initial spread of the disease. Even when authorities recognized the contagious nature of the plague, they lacked the administrative capacity to implement effective isolation measures across the vast distances of the Silk Road. The plague's journey through Asia also revealed the role of climate in disease transmission. The 14th century was a period of significant climate change, with cooling temperatures and changing precipitation patterns disrupting established ecological relationships. These environmental changes may have forced plague-carrying rodents into closer contact with human populations, facilitating the jump from animal to human hosts. The social and cultural impact of the plague in Asia was as profound as its demographic effects. In China, the disaster contributed to a turn inward, away from the cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized the Tang and Song dynasties. The Ming dynasty that emerged after the plague was more isolationist and suspicious of foreign influence than its predecessors. In the Islamic world, the plague contributed to a crisis of religious authority. If Allah was all-powerful and all-merciful, why had He allowed such suffering to befall the faithful? Some Islamic scholars interpreted the plague as a divine punishment for sin, while others saw it as a test of faith. These theological debates would influence Islamic thought for centuries to come. The plague's spread through Asia also had long-term economic consequences. The disruption of trade routes led to the development of new commercial networks that bypassed the traditional Silk Road cities. Maritime trade became increasingly important as overland routes proved vulnerable to disease and political instability. This shift would ultimately contribute to the rise of European maritime powers in the 15th and 16th centuries. By the time the plague reached the shores of the Black Sea in 1346, it had already transformed the political, economic, and social landscape of Asia. Entire civilizations had been weakened or destroyed, trade networks had been disrupted, and millions of people had died. But this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come, as the plague prepared to make the leap from Asia to Europe, carrying with it the accumulated destructive power of its journey across the world's largest continent. The Silk Road, which had once been a symbol of human achievement and cross-cultural exchange, had become a highway of death. The same networks that had spread knowledge, technology, and prosperity across Eurasia now carried a microscopic killer that would reshape the course of human history. The plague had learned to travel, and it was heading west toward an unsuspecting Europe that would soon discover the true meaning of apocalypse. When those 12 plague ships limped into the harbor of Messina in October of 1347, they carried more than just infected sailors and cargo. They carried the accumulated destructive power of a pandemic that had already devastated Asia, and they were about to unleash it on a continent that was completely unprepared for what was coming. The initial response of the Sicilian authorities was swift, but ultimately futile. Horrified by the sight of ships filled with dead and dying sailors, they ordered the vessels to leave immediately. But the damage had already been done. The plague had made landfall in Europe, and the rats and fleas that carried the disease had already begun to disperse into the urban environment of Messina. Within days, the first cases of plague appeared among the local population. The disease spread with terrifying speed through the crowded, unsanitary streets of the medieval port city. Families that had been healthy in the morning were dead by evening. Entire neighborhoods fell silent as the plague consumed their inhabitants with ruthless efficiency. From Messina, the plague spread rapidly across Sicily, and then to the Italian mainland. By December of 1347, it had reached the great trading cities of Genoa and Venice, where it found perfect conditions for explosive growth. These cities were among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan in Europe, with extensive trade networks that would carry the plague to every corner of the continent. The plague's spread through Europe followed the same patterns that had characterized its journey across Asia. It moved along trade routes, concentrated in urban areas, and exploited the interconnected nature of medieval society. But in Europe, the disease encountered conditions that would make its impact even more devastating than it had been in Asia. Medieval European cities were, by any standard, incredibly unsanitary. London, with a population of around 80,000, had no organized system of waste disposal. Human and animal waste was dumped directly into the streets or into the Thames River, which also served as the city's primary source of drinking water. Paris, the largest city in Europe with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, was described by contemporary observers as a place where the stench was so overwhelming that visitors could smell it from miles away. These conditions created perfect breeding grounds for the rats and fleas that carried the plague. Urban rat populations were enormous, thriving on the abundant food waste and garbage that littered medieval streets. The rats lived in close proximity to humans, sharing the same buildings, eating the same food scraps, and providing an ideal bridge for the plague bacterium to jump from its animal hosts to human victims. The plague's impact on individual European cities was catastrophic. Florence, one of the great centers of Renaissance culture, lost an estimated 60% of its population. The city that had produced Dante and would later nurture Michelangelo became a charnel house where the living could barely bury the dead. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, described scenes of unimaginable horror in his introduction to the Decameron. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street, others dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. Venice, despite its wealth and sophisticated government, lost approximately 60% of its population. The city's famous canals, which had made it a great maritime power, became waterways clogged with corpses. The Venetian government, normally one of the most efficient in Europe, simply collapsed under the weight of the catastrophe. In England, the plague arrived in June of 1348, landing at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, it spread rapidly across the country, reaching London by September and continuing north into Scotland and west into Wales. The English called it the Great Mortality, and contemporary chronicles describe a kingdom brought to its knees by an invisible enemy. The plague's impact on rural England was particularly devastating because the country's economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. Entire villages were abandoned as their populations died or fled. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, had recorded over 13,000 settlements in England. By 1400, nearly 3,000 of these villages had been completely abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness and their churches falling into ruin. France, already weakened by the early stages of the 100 Years' War, suffered perhaps the most devastating impact of any European country. The plague arrived in Marseille in January of 1348 and spread rapidly up the Rhône Valley toward Paris. The French capital, with its dense population and poor sanitation, became a death trap where an estimated 50,000 people died in a matter of months. The plague's spread through France was accelerated by the movement of armies and refugees fleeing the English invasion. Soldiers carried the disease from battlefield to battlefield, while civilians fleeing the war zones spread it to previously unaffected areas. The combination of war and plague created a feedback loop of destruction that would devastate France for generations. In Germany, the plague's impact was complicated by the fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. With no central authority capable of coordinating a response, each city and principality was left to face the plague alone. Some cities, like Nuremberg and Augsburg, lost over half their populations. Others, through a combination of luck and early quarantine measures, suffered less severe losses. The plague's arrival in different parts of Europe was often preceded by strange phenomena that terrified the local populations. Chroniclers reported unusual weather patterns, including violent storms, earthquakes, and strange atmospheric disturbances. While these events were probably unrelated to the plague itself, they contributed to a sense that the natural order was breaking down and that the end of the world might be at hand. The speed of the plague's spread across Europe was unprecedented in human history. In just 5 years, from 1347 to 1352, the disease had reached every corner of the continent, from the Mediterranean shores of Spain to the fjords of Norway. This rapid spread was facilitated by Europe's extensive trade networks, but it was also accelerated by the complete lack of understanding about how the disease was transmitted. Medieval Europeans had no concept of quarantine or isolation as public health measures. When the plague struck a community, the natural response was often to flee to other areas, carrying the disease with them. Pilgrims continued to travel to religious shrines, seeking divine intervention to stop the plague, but instead spreading it to new communities. Merchants continued to trade, carrying infected goods and infected fleas from city to city. The plague's impact on European society went far beyond simple mortality statistics. The disease struck all levels of society with equal ferocity, killing peasants and nobles, clergy and lay people, young and old with ruthless impartiality. This democratic nature of death challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and divine favor that had structured medieval society. The Catholic Church, which had been the dominant institution in medieval Europe, was particularly hard hit by the plague. Priests and monks, who cared for the sick and administered last rites to the dying, died at rates even higher than the general population. Entire monasteries were wiped out, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and learning. The University of Oxford lost 2/3 of its faculty, while Cambridge lost even more. The plague also had a devastating impact on European agriculture. With so many rural workers dead or fled, vast areas of cultivated land were abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields because there was no one left to harvest them. Livestock died from neglect, or were slaughtered by desperate survivors seeking food. The carefully maintained agricultural system that had supported Europe's population growth during the High Middle Ages collapsed almost overnight. The economic consequences of the plague were equally severe. Trade networks that had taken centuries to develop were disrupted as merchants died and cities were abandoned. The flow of goods across Europe slowed to a trickle as demand collapsed and supply chains were broken. Entire industries, from cloth production in Flanders to winemaking in France, were devastated by the loss of workers and markets. The plague's psychological impact on European society was perhaps even more profound than its physical effects. People who had lived through the catastrophe were forever changed by the experience of watching their world collapse around them. The certainties that had structured medieval life, the authority of the church, the stability of social hierarchies, the predictability of agricultural cycles, had all been shattered by an invisible enemy that killed without regard for rank, piety, or virtue. As the plague finally began to recede in 1353, Europe was left to count the cost of the greatest catastrophe in its history. Entire regions had been depopulated, cities lay in ruins, and the survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their shattered world. But the Black Death had done more than just kill people. It had killed the medieval world itself, clearing the way for the social economic, and cultural transformations that would define the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. The plague had revealed the fragility of human civilization and the speed with which centuries of progress could be undone by forces beyond human control. Europe's darkest hour had passed, but the scars left by the Black Death would shape the continent's development for centuries to come. The world that emerged from the plague would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, transformed by an encounter with mortality on a scale that had never been seen before and would never be forgotten. In the aftermath of the Black Death's initial devastation, something extraordinary and disturbing began to emerge across Europe. A cultural obsession with death that would define art, literature, and popular culture for centuries to come. The plague hadn't just killed bodies. It had fundamentally altered the European psyche, creating a civilization haunted by mortality and fascinated by the democracy of death. The most visible manifestation of this cultural transformation was the emergence of the danse macabre, or dance of death, an artistic and literary motif that depicted death as the great equalizer, leading people from all walks of life in a final, inevitable dance. These images appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, and in popular prints, showing skeletons or corpses dancing with emperors and peasants, bishops and beggars, young and old. The dance of death wasn't just artistic symbolism, it was a direct response to the plague's democratic nature. The Black Death had killed without regard for social status, wealth, or piety, demonstrating in the most visceral way possible that death was the one experience that truly united all humanity. Kings and commoners had died side by side, their corpses indistinguishable in the mass graves that dotted the European landscape. One of the most famous examples of the Dance of Death was painted on the walls of the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris around 1385. This massive mural showed a procession of the dead leading the living in a macabre dance, with verses in French that drove home the message, "Death spares no one, neither poor nor rich." The cemetery became a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from across Europe who came to contemplate their own mortality. The obsession with death manifested in other ways as well. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a common theme in art and literature. Skulls and skeletons appeared in paintings, jewelry, and decorative objects, serving as constant reminders of life's fragility. The ars moriendi, or art of dying, became a popular literary genre, providing detailed instructions on how to prepare for death and achieve salvation. This cultural transformation reflected a fundamental shift in European consciousness. Before the plague, death had been seen as a distant prospect, something that happened to the old, the sick, or the unlucky. The Black Death had made death immediate and universal, a constant presence that could strike anyone at any time. This awareness of mortality permeated every aspect of life, from the most intimate personal relationships to the grandest political and religious institutions. The plague also gave rise to new forms of religious expression that reflected the trauma of the pandemic. Flagellant movements swept across Europe, with groups of penitents traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They believed that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that only extreme acts of self-mortification could appease God's wrath. These flagellant processions became mass spectacles that drew enormous crowds. The flagellants would enter a town singing hymns and chanting prayers, then strip to the waist and begin beating themselves with leather whips embedded with metal spikes. Blood would flow freely as they continued their ritual for hours, sometimes days. The crowds would join in the prayers and sometimes the self-flagellation, creating scenes of mass religious hysteria. The Catholic Church initially tolerated the flagellant movement, seeing it as a genuine expression of religious devotion. But as the movement grew more extreme and began to challenge church authority, Pope Clement VI condemned it in 1349. The flagellants were accused of heresy and many were arrested or executed, but the movement continued in various forms for decades. The plague also sparked a wave of anti-Semitic violence across Europe. Jews were blamed for causing the plague through well poisoning, host desecration, and other alleged crimes. This scapegoating was particularly intense in Germanic regions, where entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs convinced that eliminating the Jews would end the plague. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death was one of the worst episodes of anti-Semitic violence in medieval Europe. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in their cemetery on Valentine's Day, 1349. In Mainz, 6,000 Jews were killed in a single day. Entire Jewish communities in the Rhineland were wiped out, not by the plague, but by their Christian neighbors. These massacres were often economically motivated, as well as religiously inspired. Many Christians owed money to Jewish moneylenders, and the plague provided a convenient excuse to eliminate these debts along with the creditors. The property of murdered Jews was confiscated by local authorities or distributed among the Christian population, providing a material incentive for violence. The plague also transformed European attitudes toward the afterlife and salvation. The traditional Catholic teaching that salvation required a lifetime of good works and proper religious observance seemed inadequate in the face of mass death. If God was allowing the righteous to die alongside the wicked, what was the point of virtue? This crisis of faith would contribute to the religious upheavals of the later Middle Ages and ultimately to the Protestant Reformation. New forms of popular piety emerged in response to the plague. The cult of Saint Roch, who was said to have cared for plague victims and died of the disease himself, spread rapidly across Europe. Churches dedicated to plague saints were built in communities that had survived the pandemic. Votive offerings and ex-votos depicting plague scenes became common in religious art. The plague also influenced the development of European literature. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague in Florence, used the pandemic as a framing device for a collection of stories told by young people fleeing the city. The work's frank treatment of sexuality, mortality, and human nature reflected the way the plague had stripped away social conventions and revealed the raw realities of human existence. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, also showed the influence of the plague years. The pilgrimage setting reflected the increased religious devotion that followed the pandemic, while the diverse cast of characters represented a society in flux, where traditional hierarchies had been disrupted by demographic catastrophe. The visual arts were equally transformed by the plague experience. Religious art became more emotional and dramatic, with increased emphasis on suffering, death, and redemption. The crucifixion, always a central theme in Christian art, took on new intensity, as artists depicted Christ's agony with unprecedented realism. The plague had made suffering universal, and art reflected this new understanding of pain as a fundamental aspect of human existence. Secular art also reflected the plague's impact. Portraits began to include symbols of mortality, skulls, hourglasses, wilted flowers, that reminded viewers of life's brevity. Landscape paintings often included ruins and abandoned buildings, reflecting the physical devastation left by the pandemic. Even decorative arts incorporated death imagery, with jewelry, furniture, and household objects featuring skulls, skeletons, and other memento mori. The plague's cultural impact extended to popular entertainment as well. Mystery plays, which had been primarily religious in nature, began to include more secular themes and darker humor. The figure of death became a popular character in these performances, often portrayed as a trickster who outwitted the proud and powerful. These plays served both as entertainment and as moral instruction, reminding audiences of their mortality while providing cathartic release from the trauma of the plague years. Music also reflected the plague's influence. The Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, a medieval chant about the Last Judgment, became increasingly popular in both religious and secular contexts. Composers began incorporating death themes into their works, creating musical memento mori that paralleled the visual arts. The plague had made death a constant presence in European consciousness, and music provided a way to express and process these dark emotions. The transformation of European culture in the wake of the Black Death was not just a temporary response to trauma. It represented a fundamental shift in worldview that would influence Western civilization for centuries to come. The plague had revealed the fragility of human existence and the universality of death, lessons that would be incorporated into art, literature, philosophy, and religion for generations. This cultural obsession with death was not morbid in the modern sense. It was a realistic acknowledgement of life's precariousness and an attempt to find meaning in the face of mortality. The dance of death and other plague-inspired art forms served as both warning and comfort, reminding people that death was universal, while also suggesting that this universality created a kind of equality that transcended social divisions. The plague had taught Europe that death was not just an individual experience, but a collective one, something that could transform entire civilizations in a matter of years. This lesson would influence European attitudes toward war, politics, religion, and social organization for centuries to come. The dance of death had begun, and in many ways, it never truly ended. It simply evolved into new forms that continued to reflect humanity's ongoing struggle to understand and accept its own mortality. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire way of life. The feudal system that had structured European society for centuries was built on a delicate balance of land, labor, and loyalty. When the plague removed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in just 5 years, that balance was shattered forever, setting in motion social and economic changes that would reshape the continent. Before the plague, European society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top sat the nobility, who owned the land and provided military service to their overlords. Below them were the clergy, who provided spiritual guidance and education. At the bottom were the peasants, roughly 90% of the population, who worked the land and supported everyone else through their labor. This system worked because land was valuable and labor was cheap. With a growing population and limited arable land, peasants had little choice but to accept whatever terms their lords offered. They were bound to the land as serfs, unable to leave without permission, forced to work their lords' fields before their own, and required to pay various taxes and fees for the privilege of existing. The plague changed everything. Suddenly, land was abundant and labor was scarce. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations lay empty because there was no one left to work them. Villages that had supported hundreds of people were reduced to a handful of survivors. The fundamental economics of feudalism had been turned upside down. The immediate impact was chaos. With so many peasants dead, the survivors found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater freedom of movement. Lords who had once dictated terms to their serfs now found themselves competing for workers, offering incentives that would have been unthinkable before the plague. In England, the government tried to maintain the old system through legislation. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from moving between employers. The law declared that every man and woman of our realm of England, of what condition he be, free or bond, able in body, and within the age of 60 years, not living in merchandise, nor exercising any craft, nor having of his own whereof he may live, nor proper land, about whose tillage he may himself occupy, and not serving any other, if he in convenient service his estate considered, be required to serve, he shall be bounden to serve him which so shall him require. But laws couldn't change economic reality. With labor so scarce, employers were willing to pay whatever it took to get workers, regardless of what the law said. Peasants began to move freely between employers, seeking the best deals they could find. The old bonds of serfdom began to dissolve as lords found it impossible to enforce traditional obligations. The transformation was particularly dramatic in England, where the plague had killed an estimated 40 to 60% of the population. Entire villages were abandoned, their fields returning to wilderness. The survivors concentrated in the most fertile areas, leaving vast stretches of countryside empty. This demographic collapse created opportunities for social mobility that had been impossible under the old system. Some peasants accumulated abandoned holdings, becoming substantial farmers in their own right. Others moved to towns and cities, where the demand for craftsmen and laborers was high. The rigid social categories that had defined medieval society began to blur as people found new ways to make a living in the post-plague world. The nobility initially resisted these changes, but they had little choice but to adapt. With their traditional sources of income disrupted, many lords were forced to convert their estates from labor-intensive agriculture to sheep farming, which required fewer workers but could be highly profitable due to the growing demand for wool. This shift from arable to pastoral farming would transform the English countryside and contribute to the enclosure movement of later centuries. In France, the plague's impact was complicated by the ongoing Hundred Years' War with England. The combination of military devastation and demographic collapse created a perfect storm of social upheaval. The French nobility, already weakened by military defeats, found their authority further undermined by the economic changes brought about by the plague. The Jacquerie of 1358 was one of the most dramatic examples of post-plague social unrest. This peasant uprising in northern France was sparked by the nobility's demands for increased taxes and labor services at a time when the peasant population had been devastated by plague and war. The rebels, led by Guillaume Cal, attacked noble estates and murdered hundreds of aristocrats before being brutally suppressed. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe as the old social order struggled to adapt to post-plague realities. In Florence, the Ciompi Revolt of 1378 saw wool workers and other laborers demand political representation and economic rights. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 brought thousands of rebels to London, where they demanded the abolition of serfdom and the establishment of a more egalitarian society. These revolts were ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their immediate goals, but they represented a fundamental shift in social consciousness. The plague had demonstrated that the existing social order was not divinely ordained or naturally inevitable. It was a human creation that could be changed. This realization would have profound implications for the development of European society. The economic changes brought about by the plague were equally dramatic. With labor scarce and expensive, there was a strong incentive to develop labor-saving technologies and more efficient production methods. This led to innovations in agriculture, manufacturing, and transportation that would lay the groundwork for the economic expansion of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period. In agriculture, the three-field system that had dominated European farming for centuries began to give way to more intensive methods. Farmers experimented with new crops, improved plowing techniques, and better livestock breeding. The increased productivity per worker helped compensate for the reduced labor force and contributed to the gradual recovery of agricultural output. Manufacturing also underwent significant changes. The guild system, which had controlled craft production in medieval cities, began to break down as masters struggled to find enough apprentices and journeymen. This created opportunities for new forms of production and organization, including the putting-out system that would eventually evolve into early industrial capitalism. The plague also accelerated the development of a money economy. With traditional feudal obligations becoming difficult to enforce, lords increasingly commuted labor services into cash payments. This monetization of social relationships contributed to the growth of banking and credit systems that would finance the commercial expansion of the later Middle Ages. The demographic impact of the plague had long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The sharp reduction in population meant that the survivors had access to more resources per capita. This led to improvements in diet, housing, and living standards that would persist for generations. Some historians argue that the post-plague period saw the highest standard of living for ordinary people in European history until the 19th century. The plague also changed patterns of settlement and land use. Many marginal lands that had been brought under cultivation during the population growth of the High Middle Ages were abandoned after the plague. This allowed forests to regenerate and wildlife populations to recover, creating a more diverse and sustainable landscape. Urban areas were also transformed by the plague. Many cities lost half or more of their population, but the survivors often found themselves with access to better housing and more opportunities for advancement. The reduced population density also led to improvements in sanitation and public health that would help prevent future epidemics. The political consequences of the plague were equally significant. The traditional feudal hierarchy, based on personal relationships and land tenure, began to give way to more centralized forms of government. Kings and princes found that they could no longer rely on feudal levies for military service and began to develop professional armies paid with cash rather than land grants. This shift toward monetary relationships and centralized authority would contribute to the rise of the modern state system. The plague had demonstrated the inadequacy of feudal institutions in dealing with large-scale crises, creating pressure for more effective forms of government and administration. The cultural impact of feudalism's collapse was equally profound. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval society for centuries were replaced by more fluid and dynamic relationships. Social mobility, while still limited, became more possible than it had been for generations. The idea that one's social position was fixed by birth began to give way to the notion that individual merit and effort could lead to advancement. This transformation of social consciousness would contribute to the intellectual and cultural developments of the Renaissance. The humanist emphasis on individual achievement and potential was partly a response to the social changes brought about by the plague. The old certainties of feudal society had been shattered, creating space for new ideas about human nature and social organization. The collapse of feudalism in the wake of the Black Death was not immediate or complete. Elements of the feudal system persisted in some areas well into the early modern period, but the fundamental relationship between land, labor, and social authority had been permanently altered. The plague had created a new world, one in which the old certainties no longer applied, and new forms of social and economic organization would have to be developed. This transformation was not without its costs. The breakdown of traditional social bonds created uncertainty and instability that would persist for generations. The revolts and upheavals that followed the plague were symptoms of a society struggling to adapt to new realities. But ultimately, the collapse of feudalism opened the way for the social, economic, and political developments that would define the modern world. The Black Death had done more than kill people. It had killed an entire way of life and cleared the ground for something new to grow. The feudal world that had emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire was itself now in ruins, and from those ruins would emerge the foundations of modern European civilization. No institution in medieval Europe was more central to daily life than the Catholic Church, and no institution was more profoundly shaken by the Black Death. The plague didn't just kill individual clergy members, it challenged the very foundations of Christian theology and authority, creating a crisis of faith that would reverberate through European society for centuries to come. Before the plague, the Catholic Church had been the dominant force in European intellectual, spiritual, and social life. It controlled vast amounts of land, wielded enormous political influence, and provided the ideological framework that justified the existing social order. The Church taught that earthly suffering was temporary, and that the righteous would be rewarded in the afterlife, while the wicked would be punished. This theology provided comfort to the masses and legitimacy to the ruling classes. The Black Death shattered these comfortable certainties. If God was all-powerful and all-merciful, why had he allowed such unprecedented suffering to befall Christian Europe? If the plague was divine punishment for sin, why did it kill the pious alongside the wicked, children alongside adults, clergy alongside lay people? These questions had no easy answers, and the Church's attempts to provide them often seemed inadequate or contradictory. The immediate impact of the plague on the Church was devastating. Priests, monks, and nuns died at rates even higher than the general population because they continued to minister to the sick and dying even as the disease spread. This dedication to duty was admirable, but it decimated the ranks of the clergy at precisely the moment when their services were most needed. In England, it's estimated that 40% of the parish clergy died during the plague years. Some dioceses lost even more. The Diocese of Winchester lost nearly half its priests, while York lost over 40%. Entire monasteries were wiped out, taking with them centuries of accumulated learning and tradition. The great monastery of Mow in Yorkshire, which had been home to 50 monks before the plague, was reduced to just 10 survivors. The loss of educated clergy had profound consequences for European intellectual life. Monasteries had been the centers of learning in medieval Europe, preserving classical texts, copying manuscripts, and maintaining schools. When these institutions were devastated by the plague, much of this intellectual infrastructure was lost. The University of Oxford lost 2/3 of its masters, while Cambridge suffered even greater losses. The shortage of clergy created a crisis in religious services. With so many priests dead, many parishes were left without spiritual leadership for months or even years. The church was forced to ordain men with minimal training, leading to a decline in the quality of religious instruction and pastoral care. Some parishes were served by priests who could barely read Latin, let alone provide sophisticated theological guidance. This crisis of clerical quality was compounded by a crisis of clerical authority. The plague had demonstrated that priests were just as vulnerable to disease and death as anyone else. The special status that had set the clergy apart from ordinary believers seemed less convincing when priests were dying in the same horrible ways as their parishioners. If the clergy had no special protection from God, what made their authority legitimate? The Church's theological response to the plague was confused and contradictory. Some clergy preached that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, particularly the sins of pride, greed, and lust that seemed to characterize the prosperous 13th century. This interpretation suggested that the plague would end when people repented and reformed their behavior. Other theologians argued that the plague was a test of faith, similar to the trials faced by Job in the Old Testament. According to this view, God was testing the faithful to see if they would maintain their devotion even in the face of unprecedented suffering. Those who remained faithful would be rewarded in the afterlife, while those who lost faith would be damned. Still others suggested that the plague was part of God's mysterious plan, incomprehensible to human reason, but ultimately serving divine purposes. This explanation had the advantage of preserving God's omnipotence and benevolence, but it offered little comfort to those who were suffering or had lost loved ones to the disease. The most radical theological response came from those who questioned whether the plague might signal the approaching end of the world. The book of Revelation described plagues and catastrophes that would precede the second coming of Christ, and some Christians believed that the Black Death might be one of these apocalyptic signs. This interpretation gave the plague cosmic significance, but also suggested that earthly institutions, including the church itself, might soon be swept away. The plague also sparked new forms of popular religiosity that often challenged church authority. The flagellant movement, which swept across Europe in the wake of the plague, represented a form of religious expression that bypassed traditional clerical mediation. Flagellants believed that they could achieve salvation through extreme acts of penance without the need for priests or sacraments. These flagellant processions became mass spectacles that drew enormous crowds. The participants would strip to the waist and beat themselves bloody with leather whips, singing hymns and chanting prayers as they moved from town to town. The movement initially had some support from church authorities, who saw it as a genuine expression of religious devotion. But as the flagellants began to claim that their self-mortification was more effective than traditional sacraments, the church moved to suppress them. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement in 1349, declaring it heretical and ordering local authorities to arrest its leaders. But the movement continued in various forms for decades, representing a persistent challenge to clerical authority and traditional religious practices. The plague also contributed to the growth of mystical movements that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine. Mystics like Meister Eckhart in Germany and Julian of Norwich in England taught that individuals could achieve union with God through contemplation and prayer, without the mediation of the institutional church. These teachings appealed to people who had lost faith in traditional religious authorities, but still sought spiritual meaning. The economic impact of the plague on the church was also severe. Many religious institutions depended on donations and bequests from the faithful, but the demographic catastrophe reduced both the number of potential donors and their ability to give. Monasteries that had been wealthy before the plague found themselves struggling to maintain their buildings and support their reduced communities. The church also lost significant amounts of land as plague-devastated areas were abandoned. Tithes and other religious taxes became difficult to collect when entire parishes were depopulated. Some religious institutions were forced to sell property or merge with other organizations to survive. The plague's impact on church authority was perhaps most visible in the rise of heretical movements that challenged orthodox doctrine. The Lollards in England, followers of John Wycliffe, argued that the Bible should be translated into vernacular languages and that ordinary believers could interpret Scripture for themselves without clerical guidance. They also questioned the necessity of the priesthood and the validity of many traditional sacraments. Similar movements emerged across Europe. The Hussites in Bohemia, followers of Jan Hus, challenged papal authority and demanded reforms in church practices. The Waldensians in France and Italy rejected the authority of the institutional church entirely, claiming that true Christianity could only be found in small communities of believers who followed the example of the apostles. These heretical movements were partly a response to the perceived failures of the church during the plague years. If the institutional church could not protect its followers from disease and death, if its clergy were no more virtuous or divinely protected than ordinary believers, then perhaps the church's claims to exclusive religious authority were false. The plague also contributed to the Great Western Schism, which divided the Catholic Church from 1378 to 1417. This crisis began with the return of the papacy from Avignon to Rome, but it was exacerbated by the social and political upheavals that followed the plague. With competing popes claiming authority and European powers supporting different claimants, the unity of the Church was shattered. The schism further undermined church authority and credibility. If the Church could not even agree on who was the legitimate pope, how could it claim to be the sole interpreter of divine will? The spectacle of competing popes excommunicating each other and their supporters made the Church appear more like a political organization than a spiritual institution. The conciliar movement, which emerged in response to the schism, represented another challenge to traditional church authority. Conciliarists argued that general councils of the Church had authority superior to that of the Pope, and that the Church should be governed by representative assemblies rather than by papal monarchy. While this movement ultimately failed to permanently restructure church government, it established precedents for limiting papal power that would be important during the Protestant Reformation. The plague's impact on popular religious practices was equally significant. The traditional emphasis on good works and gradual spiritual progress seemed inadequate in the face of sudden, arbitrary death. New forms of devotion emerged that emphasized the immediacy of salvation and the possibility of achieving grace through intense spiritual experience. The cult of the saints became more important as people sought intercessors who might protect them from plague and other disasters. Saint Roche, who was said to have cared for plague victims and died of the disease himself, became particularly popular. Churches dedicated to plague saints were built across Europe, and pilgrimage to their shrines became a common form of religious expression. The ars moriendi, or art of dying, became a popular literary genre that provided detailed instructions on how to prepare for death and achieve salvation. These works reflected the plague's impact on European consciousness, acknowledging that death could come suddenly and without warning. They emphasized the importance of spiritual preparation and the possibility of achieving salvation even at the moment of death. The transformation of European Christianity in the wake of the Black Death was not immediate or uniform. The institutional church survived the crisis and eventually recovered much of its authority and influence. But the plague had planted seeds of doubt and reform that would continue to grow for centuries. The questions raised by the plague about divine justice, clerical authority, and the nature of salvation would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and the religious wars that followed. The Black Death had challenged the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious truth and spiritual authority. While the Church survived this challenge, it emerged from the plague years weakened and transformed. The confident, unified Christianity of the High Middle Ages had been replaced by a more diverse, questioning, and ultimately more fragmented religious landscape. The plague had not destroyed the Church, but it had changed it forever, setting in motion religious developments that would reshape European civilization for centuries to come. The Black Death was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, but from the ashes of medieval medical ignorance arose the first glimmerings of modern scientific medicine. The plague's devastating impact forced European physicians to confront the limitations of their traditional approaches and begin the long, difficult process of developing new ways of understanding disease and healing. Before the plague, European medicine was dominated by the theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this system, the human body contained four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness resulted from imbalances among these humors. Treatment involved restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, dietary changes, and the administration of herbs and other substances believed to affect the humoral balance. This system had served medieval physicians reasonably well for treating common ailments, but it was utterly inadequate when confronted with the Black Death. The plague killed so quickly and so universally that traditional treatments not only failed to help, they often made things worse. Bloodletting, the most common medical intervention, weakened patients who needed all their strength to fight the infection. Purging with laxatives and emetics further debilitated victims who were already suffering from dehydration and malnutrition. The failure of traditional medicine in the face of the plague created a crisis of confidence among European physicians. The University of Paris, the most prestigious medical school in Europe, was asked by King Philip VI of France to provide an explanation for the plague's causes and suggest treatments. The faculty's response, published in 1348, revealed both the limitations of medieval medical knowledge and the beginning of a more empirical approach to understanding disease. The Paris masters attributed the plague to a conjunction of planets that had corrupted the air, creating a miasma or poisonous atmosphere that caused disease. While this explanation was incorrect, it represented an attempt to find natural rather than purely supernatural causes for the epidemic. The faculty also recommended various treatments, including bloodletting and the use of aromatic substances to purify the air, but they acknowledged that these measures had limited effectiveness. More importantly, the Paris faculty began to emphasize the importance of careful observation and documentation of the plague's symptoms and progression. They encouraged physicians to keep detailed records of their patients' conditions and to compare notes with colleagues. This emphasis on empirical observation, rather than reliance on ancient authorities, marked the beginning of a more scientific approach to medicine. The plague also forced physicians to confront the reality of contagion, a concept that had been largely ignored in medieval medical theory. While the humoral system could explain individual illness, it had difficulty accounting for diseases that spread rapidly through populations. The obvious contagious nature of the plague forced doctors to develop new theories about how diseases could be transmitted from person to person. One of the first physicians to clearly articulate a theory of contagion was Ibn al-Khatib, a Muslim doctor working in Granada. In his treatise, On the Plague, written around 1365, he argued that the disease was clearly contagious and spread through contact with infected individuals or their belongings. He wrote, "The existence of contagion is established by experience, research, the evidence of the senses, and trustworthy reports. These are the elements of proof in the natural sciences." Christian physicians were slower to accept the reality of contagion, partly because it seemed to conflict with the doctrine of divine providence. If God controlled all events, how could a disease spread according to natural laws? But the overwhelming evidence of the plague's contagious nature eventually forced even the most conservative physicians to acknowledge that diseases could be transmitted through natural mechanisms. The recognition of contagion led to the development of the first systematic public health measures in European history. The Italian city-states, which had been among the first to be struck by the plague, were also the first to develop organized responses to epidemic disease. Venice established the first quarantine system in 1348, requiring ships arriving from infected areas to wait 40 days before entering the port. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This period was chosen not for scientific reasons, but because 40 was considered a sacred number in Christian tradition. Jesus had fasted for 40 days. Moses had spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and the flood had lasted 40 days. But despite its religious origins, quarantine proved to be an effective public health measure. Other Italian cities quickly adopted similar measures. Milan, which had suffered less severely from the plague than other major cities, was particularly aggressive in implementing quarantine and isolation measures. The city authorities sealed infected houses with their inhabitants inside, posted guards to prevent anyone from entering or leaving, and burned the belongings of plague victims. These harsh measures were controversial, but they may have helped limit the plague's spread. The development of quarantine systems required new forms of medical and administrative expertise. Cities had to train officials to recognize the symptoms of plague, establish procedures for isolating suspected cases, and create systems for providing food and care to quarantined individuals. This led to the emergence of public health as a distinct field of medical practice. The plague also stimulated advances in medical education and training. The massive loss of physicians during the epidemic created an urgent need for new doctors, but it also provided an opportunity to reform medical education. Universities began to place greater emphasis on practical training and clinical observation, rather than relying solely on the study of ancient texts. The University of Montpellier in France was particularly innovative in this regard. The medical faculty there began requiring students to observe actual patients and to participate in dissections of human corpses. This hands-on approach to medical education was revolutionary in a field that had previously been dominated by theoretical study and commentary on ancient authorities. The plague also led to advances in surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge. With so many victims dying, physicians had unprecedented opportunities to observe the disease's effects on the human body. Autopsies, which had been rare in medieval Europe, became more common as doctors sought to understand how the plague killed its victims. These anatomical investigations revealed new information about the structure and function of the human body. Physicians began to understand the role of the lymphatic system in fighting infection, even though they didn't yet understand the germ theory of disease. They also gained new insights into the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, knowledge that would prove valuable in treating other diseases. The plague years also saw the development of new medical literature that emphasized practical experience over theoretical knowledge. Physicians began writing treatises based on their direct observations of plague victims rather than simply commenting on ancient texts. These works, known as plague tractates, represented a new genre of medical writing that would influence the development of clinical medicine for centuries. One of the most influential of these works was The Practice of Medicine by John of Ardern, an English surgeon who had extensive experience treating plague victims. John emphasized the importance of careful observation, accurate diagnosis, and practical treatment methods. His work marked a departure from the abstract, theorizing that had characterized much medieval medical writing. The plague also stimulated interest in preventive medicine and public health. Physicians began to recognize that preventing disease was often more effective than treating it after it had already taken hold. This led to new attention to diet, exercise, hygiene, and environmental factors that might influence health and disease. The concept of regimen sanitatis, or rules for healthy living, became increasingly popular in the post-plague period. These guides provided detailed advice on diet, sleep, exercise, and other lifestyle factors that were believed to promote health and prevent disease. While many of their recommendations were based on humoral theory rather than modern scientific understanding, they represented an important shift toward preventive medicine. The plague also contributed to the development of pharmacy and the systematic study of medicinal substances. With traditional treatments proving ineffective against the plague, physicians began experimenting with new drugs and remedies. This led to more systematic testing of medicinal plants and other substances, laying the groundwork for the development of modern pharmacology. Apothecaries, who had previously been primarily merchants selling pre-prepared remedies, began to take on more of a medical role. They started compounding their own medicines, keeping detailed records of their ingredients and effects, and working more closely with physicians to develop new treatments. This collaboration between doctors and pharmacists would become an important feature of modern medical practice. The plague years also saw the beginning of medical specialization. While medieval physicians had generally been expected to treat all types of ailments, the complexity of plague treatment led some doctors to focus on specific aspects of the disease. Some specialized in diagnosis, others in treatment, and still others in prevention and public health measures. This specialization was particularly evident in the development of plague doctors, physicians who specialized in treating epidemic diseases. These doctors developed distinctive protective clothing, including the famous beaked masks filled with aromatic substances that were believed to filter out poisonous air. While their treatments were often ineffective, plague doctors represented an early form of medical specialization that would become increasingly important in later centuries. The institutional changes brought about by the plague were equally significant. Hospitals, which had previously been primarily religious institutions focused on providing spiritual care to the dying, began to evolve into medical institutions focused on healing the sick. The plague had demonstrated the need for organized medical care, and hospitals began to hire trained physicians and develop systematic approaches to patient care. The plague also led to the establishment of new medical institutions. Boards of health were created in many Italian cities to coordinate responses to epidemic diseases. These organizations, which combined medical expertise with governmental authority, represented an early form of public health administration that would become increasingly important in later centuries. The long-term impact of the plague on medical development was profound. The crisis had forced physicians to abandon ineffective traditional treatments and begin developing new approaches based on careful observation and empirical testing. While the germ theory of disease would not be developed for another 5 centuries, the plague had planted the seeds of scientific medicine that would eventually revolutionize human health and longevity. The Black Death had been a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, but it had also been a catalyst for medical progress. The physicians who lived through the plague years had been forced to confront the limitations of their knowledge and begin the long process of developing more effective ways of understanding and treating disease. Their work would lay the foundation for the medical advances that would eventually make such devastating pandemics a thing of the past. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed an entire economic system and gave birth to the foundations of modern capitalism. The demographic catastrophe that reduced Europe's population by 1/3 in just 5 years created economic shockwaves that would reshape trade, finance, labor relations, and the very nature of wealth itself. Before the plague, the European economy was overwhelmingly agricultural and feudal. Land was the primary source of wealth, and the vast majority of the population worked as peasant farmers bound to the estates of noble lords. Trade existed, but it was limited in scope and dominated by a small merchant class. Money was important, but most economic relationships were still based on personal obligations and payments in kind rather than cash transactions. The plague shattered this system by creating the most severe labor shortage in European history. With roughly 1/3 of the population dead, the survivors found themselves in an unprecedented position of economic power. Peasants who had previously been bound to the land as serfs could now demand wages for their work. Craftsmen who had been restricted by guild regulations could now command premium prices for their skills. The fundamental relationship between capital and labor had been permanently altered. The immediate economic impact was chaotic. Agricultural production collapsed as fields lay unharvested and livestock died from neglect. Trade networks that had taken centuries to develop were disrupted as merchants died and cities were abandoned. The carefully balanced economic relationships that had sustained medieval society simply fell apart. But from this chaos emerged new opportunities. The survivors of the plague found themselves with access to more resources per capita than any generation in European history. Abandoned farms could be consolidated into larger, more efficient holdings. Empty houses in cities could be occupied by families moving up the social ladder. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands created both the capital and the incentive for economic innovation. The labor shortage created by the plague led to the first systematic use of labor-saving technology in European history. With workers scarce and expensive, there was a strong incentive to develop machines and techniques that could increase productivity. Water mills and windmills, which had been used primarily for grinding grain, were adapted for other purposes like fulling cloth and operating bellows for metalworking. The textile industry, which had been one of Europe's most important manufacturing sectors, was particularly affected by these changes. The traditional guild system, which had controlled cloth production through strict regulations on apprenticeships and working methods, began to break down as masters struggled to find enough workers. This created opportunities for entrepreneurs to develop new forms of production organization. The putting out system, which would later evolve into early industrial capitalism, emerged during this period. Instead of having all production take place in guild workshops, merchants began distributing raw materials to workers in their homes, then collecting the finished products for sale. This system allowed for greater flexibility in production and helped circumvent guild restrictions that had limited innovation. The plague also accelerated the development of banking and credit systems. With traditional feudal obligations becoming difficult to enforce, more economic relationships were conducted through monetary transactions. This increased demand for currency and credit leading to the expansion of banking services and the development of more sophisticated financial instruments. Italian banking houses, which had already been developing innovative financial techniques before the plague, found new opportunities in the post-plague economy. The Medici Bank, founded in 1397, became one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe by providing credit to merchants, manufacturers, and even governments. The bank's success was built on its ability to facilitate trade and investment in the new economic environment created by the plague. The demographic changes brought about by the plague also transformed patterns of consumption and demand. With fewer people but more wealth per capita, there was increased demand for luxury goods and services. This created new markets for skilled craftsmen and encouraged the development of more sophisticated manufacturing techniques. The production of high-quality textiles, metalwork, and other luxury goods became increasingly important in the post-plague economy. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Bruges became centers of luxury manufacturing, producing goods that were traded across Europe and beyond. This shift toward higher value production would become a characteristic feature of European economic development. The plague also had a profound impact on agricultural organization. The traditional manorial system, based on peasant labor services and feudal obligations, became increasingly difficult to maintain. Many lords found it more profitable to convert their estates from labor-intensive grain production to sheep farming, which required fewer workers but could be highly profitable due to the growing demand for wool. This shift from arable to pastoral farming had long-term consequences for the European landscape and economy. Large areas of cultivated land were converted to pasture, leading to the enclosure movement that would transform rural England in later centuries. The concentration on wool production also strengthened economic ties between England and the textile-producing regions of Flanders and Italy. The plague's impact on urban economies was equally dramatic. Many cities lost half or more of their population, but the survivors often found themselves with access to better housing, more business opportunities, and greater political influence. The reduced population density also led to improvements in sanitation and living conditions that would help prevent future epidemics. Some cities that had been relatively minor before the plague emerged as major economic centers in the post-plague period. Antwerp, for example, became one of Europe's most important commercial hubs by taking advantage of the disruption of traditional trade routes and the opportunities created by the new economic environment. The plague also contributed to the development of new forms of business organization. The traditional guild system, which had controlled most urban economic activity, began to give way to more flexible forms of commercial organization. Partnerships, joint stock companies, and other innovative business structures emerged to take advantage of new opportunities and manage the increased risks of the post-plague economy. The insurance industry, which had existed in rudimentary form before the plague, expanded significantly in response to the increased awareness of risk that the pandemic had created. Merchants who had seen their colleagues die and their businesses destroyed by the plague were willing to pay for protection against future catastrophes. This led to the development of more sophisticated insurance products and the emergence of specialized insurance companies. The plague's impact on international trade was complex and varied. While the immediate effect was to disrupt established trade routes and reduce the volume of commerce, the long-term consequences were more positive. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands created new demand for luxury goods, while the development of new production techniques and business organizations made trade more efficient and profitable. The traditional trade routes that had connected Europe with Asia were permanently altered by the plague. The overland Silk Road, which had been disrupted by the pandemic, never fully recovered its former importance. This created opportunities for maritime trade routes and contributed to the age of exploration that would begin in the 15th century. European merchants, faced with the disruption of traditional trade networks, began to seek new markets and new sources of goods. This led to increased exploration of African and Atlantic trade routes, laying the groundwork for the colonial expansion that would reshape the global economy in later centuries. The plague also had important consequences for monetary systems and the development of capitalism. The increased use of money in economic transactions, combined with the concentration of wealth in fewer hands, created new opportunities for capital accumulation and investment. This led to the emergence of a true capitalist class that derived its wealth from investment and entrepreneurship rather than land ownership. The concept of profit, which had been viewed with suspicion by medieval Christian theology, became more accepted in the post-plague period. The Church's traditional prohibition on usury began to break down as the need for credit and investment became more apparent. This theological shift was crucial for the development of modern capitalism. The plague also contributed to the development of new accounting and business management techniques. With more complex business relationships and greater emphasis on monetary transactions, merchants needed better ways to track their assets, liabilities, and profits. This led to the development of double-entry bookkeeping and other accounting innovations that would become standard business practices. The long-term economic consequences of the Black Death were profound and lasting. The plague had destroyed the feudal economy of medieval Europe and created the conditions for the emergence of modern capitalism. The demographic catastrophe had concentrated wealth, created labor shortages that encouraged technological innovation, and disrupted traditional economic relationships in ways that opened up new opportunities for entrepreneurship and investment. The economic revolution that began with the Black Death would continue for centuries, ultimately leading to the Industrial Revolution and the modern global economy. The plague had not just killed people. It had killed an entire way of organizing economic life and given birth to the system that would dominate the world for the next 7 centuries. The survivors of the Black Death had inherited a world transformed by catastrophe, but they had also inherited unprecedented opportunities for economic advancement and innovation. The plague had cleared away the rigid structures of feudal society and created space for new forms of economic organization that would prove far more dynamic and productive than anything that had come before. In the most literal sense, the Black Death had been the midwife of modern capitalism. The Black Death didn't just change how Europeans lived, it fundamentally transformed how they fought and died. The demographic catastrophe that swept across the continent in the 14th century reshaped military organization, tactics, and technology in ways that would define European warfare for centuries to come. Before the plague, medieval warfare was dominated by heavy cavalry, armored knights fighting on horseback, who formed the military elite of feudal society. These warriors were expensive to equip and maintain, but they were devastatingly effective against infantry forces. The entire social and economic structure of medieval Europe was organized around supporting these mounted warriors and their retinues. The feudal system provided knights with land grants in exchange for military service. When a lord needed an army, he would call upon his vassals, who were obligated to provide a certain number of knights for a specified period, usually 40 days. This system had worked reasonably well for centuries, but it was built on the assumption of a stable population and established social relationships. The Black Death shattered these assumptions. The massive population loss made it impossible to maintain traditional feudal levies. Many noble families were wiped out entirely, while others were so reduced in numbers that they could no longer fulfill their military obligations. The careful balance of land tenure and military service that had sustained the feudal system simply collapsed. At the same time, the plague created new opportunities for military innovation. The labor shortage that followed the demographic catastrophe made traditional forms of military organization prohibitively expensive. Lords who had previously relied on large numbers of peasant foot soldiers found that they could no longer afford to maintain such forces. This created pressure to develop more efficient and cost-effective military technologies and tactics. The most significant military innovation of the post-plague period was the increased use of gunpowder weapons. Cannons had been introduced to European warfare in the early 14th century, but they had been crude, unreliable, and expensive. The economic and social changes brought about by the plague created both the incentive and the resources needed to improve these weapons. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands meant that surviving nobles and emerging merchant classes had the capital needed to invest in expensive new military technologies. At the same time, the shortage of traditional soldiers made it necessary to find ways to multiply the effectiveness of smaller forces. Gunpowder weapons offered a solution to both problems. Early cannons were primarily used for siege warfare, where their ability to breach castle walls made them invaluable despite their limitations. The psychological impact of these weapons was as important as their physical effects. The thunderous noise and spectacular destruction caused by cannon fire could break the morale of defenders who had never encountered such weapons before. The development of portable firearms was equally revolutionary. Early handguns were crude and unreliable, but they had one crucial advantage. They could be used effectively by soldiers with minimal training. A peasant with a few weeks of instruction could use a firearm to kill a knight who had spent decades perfecting his martial skills. This democratization of military effectiveness would have profound social and political consequences. The plague also accelerated the development of professional armies. The traditional feudal levy system, based on temporary service by vassals, became increasingly inadequate for the complex military challenges of the post-plague period. Wars lasted longer, required more specialized skills, and demanded greater coordination than the feudal system could provide. Instead of relying on feudal obligations, rulers began to hire professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than land grants. These mercenary companies, known as free companies or condottieri in Italy, became increasingly important in European warfare. They offered several advantages over feudal levies. They were available year-round. They had specialized military skills, and they could be deployed wherever they were needed without regard to feudal obligations. The most famous of these mercenary companies was the White Company, led by the English knight Sir John Hawkwood. This force of professional soldiers fought throughout Italy in the late 14th century, offering their services to the highest bidder. Hawkwood and his men became wealthy through their military skills, demonstrating that warfare could be a profitable profession for those who survived its dangers. The rise of professional armies also led to changes in military organization and tactics. Professional soldiers could be trained to use complex formations and coordinate their actions in ways that were impossible with feudal levies. This led to the development of more sophisticated battlefield tactics and the emergence of military engineering as a specialized field. The Swiss pikemen were perhaps the most successful military innovation of the post-plague period. These professional infantry forces, armed with long pikes and fighting in tight formations, proved capable of defeating even the finest heavy cavalry. The Swiss developed their military system partly in response to the demographic changes brought about by the plague, which had made traditional forms of military organization impractical in their mountainous homeland. The success of Swiss tactics influenced military development throughout Europe. Other regions began to develop their own professional infantry forces, leading to a gradual decline in the importance of heavy cavalry. The knight, who had dominated European battlefields for centuries, was slowly being replaced by disciplined formations of professional foot soldiers. The plague also had important consequences for military technology beyond gunpowder weapons. The shortage of skilled craftsmen created incentives to develop more efficient methods of producing weapons and armor. This led to innovations in metallurgy, manufacturing techniques, and quality control that would have applications far beyond military use. The development of plate armor reached its peak in the post-plague period, partly as a response to the threat posed by new weapons. Armorers developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for creating protective equipment that could withstand crossbow bolts, early firearms, and other threats. The finest armor of the 15th century was a masterpiece of metallurgical skill, offering protection that was nearly impervious to most weapons of the time. But even as armor reached new heights of effectiveness, it was becoming increasingly obsolete. The development of more powerful firearms gradually made even the finest armor inadequate protection. This led to changes in military tactics that emphasized mobility and firepower over protection, further accelerating the decline of traditional heavy cavalry. The plague's impact on naval warfare was equally significant. The demographic catastrophe had disrupted traditional maritime trade routes and created new opportunities for naval innovation. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands provided the capital needed to build larger, more sophisticated ships, while the development of gunpowder weapons revolutionized naval combat. The introduction of cannons to naval warfare transformed ship design and tactics. Ships began to be built specifically as gun platforms, with multiple decks of cannons that could deliver devastating broadsides against enemy vessels. This led to the development of the ship of the line, a type of warship that would dominate naval warfare for centuries. The plague also contributed to the development of new forms of military engineering. The traditional castle, designed to withstand siege by conventional weapons, became increasingly vulnerable to cannon fire. This led to the development of new fortification designs that could better resist gunpowder weapons. The Trace Italian, or Star Fort, was the most important innovation in military architecture of the post-plague period. These fortifications, with their low, thick walls and angular bastions, were specifically designed to withstand cannon bombardment. The development of these new fortification systems required sophisticated mathematical and engineering skills, leading to the emergence of military engineering as a professional discipline. The economic consequences of these military changes were profound. The development of gunpowder weapons and professional armies required significant capital investment, which favored wealthy states and rulers over smaller, poorer ones. This contributed to the centralization of political power and the emergence of the modern state system. The cost of maintaining professional armies and investing in new military technologies also created pressure for more efficient tax collection and financial administration. Rulers who wanted to compete militarily had to develop more sophisticated governmental institutions capable of raising and managing the resources needed for modern warfare. The plague had also changed the social composition of armies. Before the pandemic, military service had been primarily the responsibility of the nobility and their retainers. After the plague, armies increasingly consisted of professional soldiers drawn from all levels of society. This democratization of military service would have important political consequences, as rulers became dependent on the loyalty of common soldiers rather than just noble vassals. The psychological impact of the plague on military culture was equally significant. The pandemic had demonstrated the fragility of human life and the unpredictability of death. This awareness of mortality influenced military thinking, leading to greater emphasis on decisive battles and quick campaigns rather than prolonged sieges and wars of attrition. The plague had also broken down many of the social barriers that had previously separated different classes of warriors. Noble knights and common soldiers had died side by side during the pandemic, creating a sense of shared mortality that influenced military culture for generations. This contributed to the development of more egalitarian military institutions and the gradual decline of the rigid social hierarchies that had characterized medieval warfare. The long-term consequences of these military changes were profound. The innovations in weapons, tactics, and organization that emerged in the post-plague period would shape European warfare for centuries to come. The development of gunpowder weapons would eventually lead to the military revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, while the emergence of professional armies would contribute to the rise of the modern state system. The Black Death had not just killed people, it had killed an entire way of making war. The feudal military system that had dominated European warfare for centuries was replaced by new forms of military organization that were more professional, more technologically sophisticated, and ultimately more deadly. The plague had transformed not just how Europeans lived, but how they fought and died, creating military innovations that would shape the course of world history for centuries to come. From the ashes of the Black Death arose one of the most remarkable cultural and intellectual movements in human history, the Renaissance. This flowering of art, literature, philosophy, and scientific inquiry was not merely coincidental with the plague's aftermath. It was, in many ways, a direct response to the demographic and social catastrophe that had reshaped European civilization. The connection between the Black Death and the Renaissance might seem paradoxical at first glance. How could such devastating mortality lead to such an explosion of creativity and human achievement? The answer lies in the profound ways that the plague transformed European society, creating conditions that were uniquely favorable to intellectual and artistic innovation. The most immediate factor was economic. The demographic catastrophe had concentrated wealth in fewer hands, creating a class of survivors who had unprecedented resources to devote to non-essential activities like art, literature, and learning. In Florence, for example, families like the Medici had accumulated vast fortunes partly through their survival of the plague and their ability to take advantage of the economic opportunities it created. This concentration of wealth was crucial for the development of Renaissance culture because artistic and intellectual pursuits required patronage. The complex paintings, elaborate sculptures, and scholarly investigations that characterize the Renaissance were expensive undertakings that could only be supported by wealthy individuals or institutions. The post-plague economy had created exactly the kind of concentrated wealth needed to fund such activities. But the Renaissance was more than just the product of economic opportunity. It was also a response to the intellectual and spiritual crisis created by the plague. The pandemic had shattered many of the certainties that had structured medieval thought, creating space for new ideas and approaches to understanding the world. The plague had demonstrated the limitations of traditional authorities: medical, religious, and political. If learned physicians could not heal the sick, if priests could not protect their flocks, if kings could not defend their subjects, then perhaps these authorities were not as reliable as had been believed. This crisis of authority created an opening for new forms of knowledge and new ways of understanding the world. The humanist movement that emerged in the 14th and 15th centuries was partly a response to this crisis. Humanists like Petrarch and Boccaccio turned away from the abstract theological speculation that had dominated medieval scholarship and instead focused on human experience, emotion, and achievement. They studied classical texts not just for their religious or philosophical content, but for their insights into human nature and the possibilities of human accomplishment. This shift toward humanism was directly influenced by the plague experience. The pandemic had made human mortality and vulnerability impossible to ignore, but it had also demonstrated human resilience and creativity in the face of catastrophe. The survivors of the plague had rebuilt their shattered world, often improving upon what had existed before. This experience of human agency and capability influenced the humanist emphasis on human potential and achievement. The plague had also changed European attitudes toward time and mortality in ways that influenced Renaissance culture. The medieval worldview had emphasized the temporary nature of earthly life and the importance of preparing for eternity. The plague had made death immediate and universal, but it had also made life more precious and urgent. This created a new emphasis on making the most of earthly existence, on achieving greatness and leaving a lasting legacy. This shift in temporal perspective is visible throughout Renaissance art and literature. Medieval art had been primarily religious in focus, designed to direct the viewer's attention toward spiritual matters in the afterlife. Renaissance art, while still often religious in subject matter, showed a new interest in the physical world, in human emotion and experience, and in the beauty of earthly existence. The development of perspective in painting is a perfect example of this transformation. Medieval art had been largely symbolic, with little concern for realistic representation of physical space. Renaissance artists like Brunelleschi and Masaccio developed mathematical techniques for creating the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This innovation reflected a new interest in the physical world and a new confidence in human ability to understand and represent natural phenomena. The plague had also contributed to the Renaissance by disrupting traditional educational institutions and creating opportunities for new forms of learning. Many monasteries and cathedral schools had been devastated by the pandemic, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. But this destruction also created space for new educational approaches and institutions. The University of Florence, founded in 1349 just as the plague was receding, represented a new model of higher education that emphasized practical skills and humanistic learning rather than purely theological study. Similar institutions emerged throughout Europe, creating a network of scholars and intellectuals who shared new approaches to knowledge and learning. The plague had also facilitated the rediscovery of classical texts that had been lost or forgotten during the medieval period. The disruption of traditional institutions had scattered manuscripts and created opportunities for scholars to discover works that had been hidden away in monastery libraries or private collections. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 brought Greek scholars and their manuscripts to Western Europe, further enriching the Renaissance recovery of classical learning. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, was another crucial factor in the spread of Renaissance ideas. While the printing press was not directly caused by the plague, its rapid adoption and impact were facilitated by the social and economic changes that the pandemic had created. The The concentration of wealth and the growth of urban centers provided both the capital and the market needed for printed books to become commercially viable. The availability of printed books revolutionized the spread of knowledge and ideas. Texts that had previously been available only to a small number of scholars could now be reproduced and distributed widely. This democratization of knowledge was crucial for the development of Renaissance humanism and the scientific revolution that would follow. The plague's impact on Renaissance art was particularly profound. The pandemic had made death a constant presence in European consciousness, and this awareness of mortality permeated Renaissance artistic expression. But rather than leading to morbid or depressing art, this awareness of death often inspired artists to celebrate life with unprecedented intensity and beauty. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies, for example, were partly motivated by his desire to understand the human body and the processes of life and death. His dissections of corpses, many of them plague victims, provided him with detailed knowledge of human anatomy that he incorporated into his paintings and drawings. The result was art that captured human form and emotion with unprecedented realism and power. Michelangelo's sculptures and paintings similarly reflected the Renaissance fascination with human potential and achievement. His David, carved from a single block of marble, represented the triumph of human skill and creativity over the limitations of raw material. His Sistine Chapel ceiling depicted the creation of humanity with a grandeur and dignity that reflected the humanist belief in human worth and potential. The plague had also influenced Renaissance literature in profound ways. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio had lived through the pandemic and incorporated their experiences into their works. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague in Florence, used the pandemic as a framing device for a collection of stories that explored the full range of human experience, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the sacred to the profane. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and fame was also partly a response to the plague experience. The pandemic had demonstrated how quickly human accomplishments could be erased. Entire cities had been depopulated, libraries had been destroyed, and centuries of accumulated knowledge had been lost. This awareness of the fragility of human achievement created a new urgency about creating lasting works that could survive the ravages of time and catastrophe. The concept of the Renaissance man, the individual who excelled in multiple fields of endeavor, reflected this desire to maximize human potential and achievement. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, who was simultaneously an artist, scientist, engineer, and inventor, embodied the Renaissance belief that human beings were capable of extraordinary accomplishment if they applied themselves with sufficient dedication and skill. The plague had also contributed to the Renaissance by creating new forms of social mobility and opportunity. The demographic catastrophe had disrupted traditional social hierarchies and created opportunities for talented individuals to rise in society regardless of their birth. This social fluidity was crucial for the development of Renaissance culture, which depended on the emergence of new elites who were willing to patronize innovative art and learning. The scientific revolution that began during the Renaissance was also influenced by the plague experience. The pandemic had demonstrated the limitations of traditional medical knowledge and created pressure for new approaches to understanding disease and health. This led to increased interest in empirical observation, experimentation, and the systematic study of natural phenomena. The development of the scientific method, with its emphasis on observation, hypothesis formation, and experimental testing, was partly a response to the failure of traditional authorities during the plague years. If ancient texts and established authorities could not provide reliable knowledge about disease and health, then perhaps new methods of investigation were needed. The Renaissance transformation of European culture was not immediate or uniform. The movement began in Italy in the 14th century and gradually spread to other parts of Europe over the following 2 centuries. Different regions developed their own distinctive forms of Renaissance culture, influenced by local conditions and traditions. But throughout Europe, the Renaissance represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, from a medieval worldview that emphasized human limitation and dependence on divine authority to a new vision that celebrated human potential and achievement. This transformation was not just an intellectual or artistic movement. It was a response to the lived experience of surviving and rebuilding after the greatest catastrophe in European history. The Black Death had killed millions of people and destroyed much of medieval civilization. But from the ruins of that catastrophe had emerged a new vision of human possibility that would inspire some of the greatest achievements in art, literature, science, and philosophy in human history. The plague had not just ended the medieval world, it had given birth to the modern one, creating the conditions for a renaissance of the human spirit that would reshape civilization for centuries to come. The Black Death officially ended in 1353, but its shadow stretched across centuries, shaping European civilization in ways that are still visible today. The plague had done more than kill people. It had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development, creating ripple effects that would influence politics, economics, religion, and culture for generations to come. The most immediate and visible legacy of the plague was demographic. Europe's population, which had reached perhaps 75 million before the pandemic, fell to around 50 million by 1353. This represented not just a temporary setback, but a fundamental shift in the continent's demographic trajectory. It would take nearly 2 centuries for Europe's population to return to pre-plague levels, and the social and economic consequences of this demographic catastrophe would persist even longer. The population decline had profound effects on settlement patterns and land use. Thousands of villages that had been abandoned during the plague years were never reoccupied. In England alone, nearly 3,000 settlements recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086 had disappeared by 1400. These lost villages became archaeological sites, their foundations hidden beneath grass and wildflowers, silent testimony to the plague's devastating impact. The abandoned agricultural land gradually returned to forest, creating a more wooded landscape than had existed for centuries. This reforestation had important ecological consequences, providing habitat for wildlife populations that had been reduced by medieval agricultural expansion. In some regions, wolves and other large predators returned to areas where they had been extinct for generations. The demographic changes also had long-term genetic consequences. The plague had not killed randomly. It had selected against certain genetic variants while favoring others. People with genetic mutations that provided resistance to Yersinia pestis were more likely to survive and reproduce, gradually increasing the frequency of these protective alleles in the European population. Modern genetic studies have confirmed that Europeans today carry genetic markers that reflect their ancestors' encounter with the Black Death. Variants of genes involved in immune function, particularly those related to resistance to bacterial infections, show clear evidence of having been selected for during the plague years. In a very real sense, the Black Death helped shape the modern European genome. The plague's impact on European political development was equally profound. The demographic catastrophe had weakened traditional feudal institutions and accelerated the centralization of political power. Kings and princes who survived the plague found themselves ruling over smaller but more manageable populations, with reduced noble opposition and greater resources per capita. This centralization of power contributed to the emergence of the modern state system. The complex administrative apparatus needed to govern post-plague societies required professional bureaucracies, standing armies, and sophisticated tax collection systems. These institutions, developed in response to the challenges of the post-plague world, would become the foundation of modern European governments. The plague also influenced the development of international relations. The pandemic had demonstrated that diseases could spread rapidly across political boundaries, creating shared vulnerabilities that transcended national divisions. This awareness would eventually contribute to the development of international cooperation in public health, though such cooperation would not become systematic until centuries later. The economic legacy of the Black Death was equally lasting. The demographic catastrophe had accelerated the transition from feudalism to capitalism, creating new forms of economic organization that would dominate European development for centuries. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands had provided the capital needed for commercial expansion, while the labor shortage had encouraged technological innovation and more efficient production methods. The plague had also contributed to the development of new financial institutions and practices. The increased use of money in economic transactions, combined with the need for more sophisticated risk management, had led to innovations in banking, insurance, and accounting, that would become standard features of modern capitalism. The global expansion of European trade and colonization that began in the 15th century was partly a consequence of the economic changes brought about by the plague. The concentration of capital, the development of new business organizations, and the pressure to find new markets and sources of labor all contributed to the age of exploration and the eventual establishment of European colonial empires. The religious legacy of the Black Death was complex and contradictory. The plague had challenged traditional Christian theology and authority, contributing to the religious upheavals of the later Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation. The questions raised by the pandemic about divine justice, clerical authority, and the nature of salvation would continue to influence European religious thought for centuries. At the same time, the plague had also contributed to new forms of popular piety and religious expression. The cult of the saints, the emphasis on personal devotion, and the development of new religious movements all reflected the spiritual needs of people who had lived through unprecedented catastrophe. These religious innovations would become permanent features of European Christianity. The plague's impact on European culture and intellectual life was perhaps its most enduring legacy. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment all had roots in the social and intellectual changes brought about by the pandemic. The humanist emphasis on human potential, the scientific method's focus on empirical observation, and the Enlightenment's critique of traditional authority all reflected lessons learned during the plague years. The cultural obsession with death that emerged in the wake of the plague would persist in various forms for centuries. The memento mori tradition, the dance of death motif, and the broader awareness of human mortality that characterized post-plague European culture would influence art, literature, and philosophy well into the modern period. The plague also had important consequences for the development of medicine and public health. The pandemic had demonstrated the limitations of traditional medical knowledge and the importance of empirical observation and systematic investigation. The medical advances that began during the plague years would eventually lead to the development of modern scientific medicine and the conquest of many infectious diseases. The public health measures developed in response to the plague, quarantine, isolation, and systematic disease surveillance, would become standard tools for controlling epidemic diseases. The institutional frameworks created to manage the plague response would evolve into modern public health systems that continue to protect populations from infectious disease outbreaks. The plague's influence on European attitudes toward government and authority was equally lasting. The pandemic had demonstrated that traditional authorities, medical, religious, and political, could fail catastrophically when faced with unprecedented challenges. This awareness would contribute to the development of more accountable and responsive forms of government. Though this process would take centuries to complete, the concept of the social contract, which would become central to modern political theory, was partly rooted in the plague experience. The pandemic had shown that the relationship between rulers and subjects was not simply a matter of divine appointment or traditional obligation. It was a practical arrangement that had to serve the needs of both parties. If rulers could not protect their subjects from catastrophe, then perhaps the subjects had the right to seek new forms of government. The plague also influenced European attitudes toward social hierarchy and inequality. The pandemic had demonstrated that death was the great equalizer, killing rich and poor, noble and peasant with equal efficiency. This awareness of fundamental human equality would eventually contribute to the development of more egalitarian political and social institutions, though this process would be slow and often violent. The environmental legacy of the Black Death was also significant. The massive population decline had reduced human pressure on European ecosystems, allowing forests to regenerate and wildlife populations to recover. This environmental recovery would provide resources for the economic expansion of later centuries, while also creating a more diverse and resilient landscape. The plague had also demonstrated the interconnectedness of human and natural systems. The pandemic had spread through trade networks, urban environments, and agricultural systems, showing how human activities could create vulnerabilities to natural disasters. This awareness would eventually contribute to the development of more sophisticated understanding of environmental risks and the need for sustainable development practices. The psychological legacy of the Black Death was perhaps the most subtle, but also the most pervasive. The pandemic had created a collective trauma that would influence European consciousness for generations. The awareness of human vulnerability, the recognition of life's fragility, and the understanding of how quickly civilization could collapse would become permanent features of European culture. This psychological legacy would manifest in various ways: in the continued popularity of apocalyptic literature and art, in the persistent fear of epidemic disease, and in the development of institutions designed to provide security and stability in an uncertain world. The insurance industry, the welfare state, and even modern emergency management systems all reflect in part lessons learned from the Black Death. The plague had also created a new awareness of the importance of social solidarity and mutual support. The communities that had survived the pandemic were often those that had maintained social cohesion and cooperation in the face of catastrophe. This lesson would influence the development of European social institutions and the emphasis on community responsibility that would characterize many European societies. The global legacy of the Black Death extends far beyond Europe. The pandemic had been part of a larger pattern of disease exchange that would continue as European exploration and colonization brought Old World diseases to the Americas, Africa, and other regions. The demographic catastrophes that followed European contact with indigenous populations around the world were, in many ways, repetitions of the Black Death experience on a global scale. The scientific and medical knowledge developed in response to the plague would eventually help control infectious diseases worldwide, but the social and economic patterns established during the post-plague period would also contribute to global inequality and exploitation. The concentration of wealth and power that had emerged from the plague's demographic catastrophe would provide the resources for European expansion and colonization, with consequences that are still being felt today. The Black Death had been more than just a pandemic. It had been a transformative event that reshaped human civilization. Its legacy can be seen in the political institutions that govern us, the economic systems that organize our societies, the scientific methods we use to understand the world, and the cultural values that define our humanity. The plague's influence on the development of modern science cannot be overstated. The pandemic had shattered confidence in traditional authorities and created a demand for new ways of understanding the natural world. The empirical method that emerged from this crisis, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and systematic testing of hypotheses, would eventually lead to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The germ theory of disease, which would not be fully developed until the 19th century, had its intellectual roots in the plague years. The physicians who observed the Black Death spread were among the first to seriously consider the possibility that diseases could be transmitted through natural mechanisms rather than supernatural causes. This insight, though not fully understood at the time, planted the seeds for the medical breakthroughs that would eventually conquer infectious diseases. The plague also influenced the development of statistics and probability theory. The need to understand and predict the spread of epidemic diseases led to some of the earliest attempts at systematic data collection and analysis. The bills of mortality that began to be kept in London and other cities during the plague years were among the first examples of systematic public health surveillance, and they provided the data that would later be used to develop statistical methods for understanding population dynamics and disease patterns. The social legacy of the Black Death was equally profound. The pandemic had accelerated the breakdown of rigid social hierarchies and created new opportunities for social mobility. While this process was slow and often violent, it ultimately contributed to the development of more egalitarian societies and the recognition of individual rights and freedoms. The concept of human rights, which would not be fully articulated until the 18th century, had its roots in the plague experience. The pandemic had demonstrated that all human beings, regardless of their social status, were equally vulnerable to suffering and death. This recognition of fundamental human equality would eventually contribute to the development of legal and political systems that recognize the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. The plague had also contributed to the development of more sophisticated understanding of social welfare and public responsibility. The communities that had survived the pandemic were often those that had maintained systems of mutual support and collective action. This experience would influence the development of social welfare systems and the recognition that society had a responsibility to care for its most vulnerable members. The educational legacy of the Black Death was also significant. The pandemic had disrupted traditional educational institutions, but had also created new opportunities for learning and intellectual development. The universities that emerged in the post-plague period were often more innovative and flexible than their medieval predecessors, emphasizing practical skills and empirical investigation rather than purely theoretical study. The development of vernacular literature and the spread of literacy were also influenced by the plague. The demographic catastrophe had disrupted the Latin-speaking clerical elite that had dominated medieval intellectual life, creating opportunities for new forms of literary expression in local languages. The printing press, which emerged in the post-plague period, made books more widely available and contributed to the spread of literacy among the general population. The plague's influence on the development of modern cities was equally important. The pandemic had demonstrated the dangers of overcrowding and poor sanitation, leading to new approaches to urban planning and public health. The cities that were rebuilt after the plague often incorporated better drainage systems, wider streets, and more open spaces, innovations that would become standard features of modern urban design. The development of professional fire departments, police forces, and other urban services was also influenced by the plague experience. The pandemic had shown how quickly urban systems could collapse in the face of crisis, creating pressure for more robust and reliable public services. These institutions, developed in response to the challenges of the post-plague world, would become essential features of modern urban life. The plague also influenced the development of modern transportation and communication systems. The pandemic had spread along trade routes and communication networks, demonstrating both the benefits and the dangers of increased connectivity. This awareness would influence the development of transportation and communication systems that were both more efficient and more resilient to disruption. The maritime technologies that enabled the age of exploration were partly developed in response to the plague's disruption of overland trade routes. The need to find new ways to connect distant markets and sources of goods led to innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime organization that would make possible the global expansion of European trade and influence. The plague's impact on the development of modern warfare was also lasting. The demographic catastrophe had made traditional forms of military organization obsolete and had accelerated the development of gunpowder weapons and professional armies. These military innovations would shape the conduct of warfare for centuries and would contribute to the rise of the modern state system. The development of military engineering, fortification design, and logistics systems was also influenced by the plague experience. The pandemic had demonstrated the importance of being able to maintain military forces in the face of disease and other challenges, leading to innovations in military medicine, supply systems, and organizational structures that would become standard features of modern armies. The plague's influence on the development of modern diplomacy and international relations was equally significant. The pandemic had demonstrated that challenges like epidemic disease could not be addressed by individual nations acting alone. They required international cooperation and coordination. While systematic international cooperation in public health would not emerge until much later, the intellectual foundations for such cooperation were laid during the plague years. The concept of sovereignty, which would become central to the modern state system, was also influenced by the plague experience. The pandemic had shown that effective government required the ability to control territory, manage populations, and respond to crises. These requirements would contribute to the development of more centralized and powerful state institutions that could exercise effective sovereignty over their territories. The plague also influenced the development of modern economic theory and practice. The demographic catastrophe had created new forms of scarcity and abundance, challenging traditional economic assumptions and creating pressure for new ways of understanding economic relationships. The labor theory of value, the concept of supply and demand, and other fundamental economic principles all had roots in the economic transformations brought about by the plague. The development of modern capitalism was also profoundly influenced by the plague. The concentration of wealth, the development of new financial institutions, and the emergence of new forms of business organization all contributed to the capitalist system that would dominate global economic development for centuries. The plague had not created capitalism, but it had accelerated its development and shaped its fundamental characteristics. the environmental legacy of the Black Death continues to influence our world today. The reforestation that occurred in the wake of the demographic catastrophe helped create the forest resources that would fuel European economic expansion in later centuries. The recovery of wildlife populations provided the biological diversity that would support more complex and resilient ecosystems. The plague had also demonstrated the interconnectedness of human and natural systems in ways that would eventually contribute to the development of ecological thinking and environmental science. The understanding that human activities could create vulnerabilities to natural disasters would eventually lead to more sophisticated approaches to environmental management and sustainable development. Perhaps most importantly, the Black Death had demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization. The pandemic had shown how quickly centuries of progress could be undone by forces beyond human control, but it had also shown how human beings could adapt, innovate, and rebuild in the face of unprecedented challenges. This dual lesson of vulnerability and resilience would become a permanent feature of European consciousness and would influence the development of institutions and practices designed to provide security and stability in an uncertain world. The insurance industry, the welfare state, emergency management systems, and international cooperation mechanisms all reflect, in part, lessons learned from the Black Death. The plague had also created a new awareness of the importance of scientific knowledge and rational planning in addressing complex challenges. The failure of traditional authorities during the pandemic had demonstrated the need for more reliable ways of understanding and responding to crises. This awareness would contribute to the development of the scientific method, evidence-based policymaking, and other approaches that would become central to modern governance and problem-solving. The Black Death had been the greatest catastrophe in European history, but it had also been a catalyst for some of the most important developments in human civilization. The pandemic had destroyed the medieval world, but from its ashes had emerged the foundations of the modern world, with all its achievements and all its continuing challenges. The long shadow of the Black Death reminds us that human civilization is both more fragile and more resilient than we often imagine. The pandemic had shown how quickly our world can change, how rapidly our certainties can be shattered, and how completely our lives can be transformed by forces beyond our control. But it had also shown that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, innovation, and renewal in the face of even the most devastating challenges. As we face our own global challenges, climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruption, and social inequality, the lessons of the Black Death remain relevant. The pandemic had taught our ancestors that survival and recovery require not just individual resilience, but collective action. Not just traditional wisdom, but innovative thinking. Not just local solutions, but global cooperation. The Black Death had ended more than 6 centuries ago, but its shadow still stretches across our world, reminding us of both our vulnerability and our strength, both our mortality and our capacity for renewal. The plague that had wiped out half of humanity had also, in the end, helped create the world we inhabit today. A world shaped by catastrophe, but also by the human spirit's remarkable ability to rise from the ashes and build something new. As we reach the end of our journey through one of history's darkest chapters, we're left with questions that echo across the centuries. How could a microscopic organism bring the mighty civilizations of Europe, Asia, and Africa to their knees? How did humanity survive its closest brush with extinction? And perhaps most importantly, what does the Black Death teach us about our own world and our own vulnerabilities? The plague that swept across the known world between 1330 and 1353 was more than just a disease. It was a revelation. It revealed the interconnectedness of human societies, the fragility of our achievements, and the speed with which centuries of progress could be undone. But it also revealed something else: the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and our capacity to rebuild, adapt, and ultimately transcend even the most devastating catastrophes. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people worldwide, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population, and similar proportions across Asia and North Africa. These aren't just statistics. They represent the erasure of entire bloodlines, the silencing of languages, the abandonment of cities that had stood for millennia. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed entire ways of life. Yet from this unprecedented catastrophe emerged some of the most important developments in human history. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the rise of modern capitalism, the development of public health systems, the emergence of the modern state. All of these transformations had their roots in the social, economic, and intellectual upheavals caused by the Black Death. The plague taught our ancestors that traditional authorities, medical, religious, and political, could fail catastrophically when faced with unprecedented challenges. This lesson sparked a revolution in human thinking that emphasized empirical observation over received wisdom, individual merit over inherited status, and rational inquiry over blind faith. The modern world, with all its achievements and continuing struggles, was born from this crisis of authority. The demographic catastrophe also revealed the fundamental interconnectedness of human societies. The plague had spread along trade routes, following the very networks that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange. It showed that in an interconnected world, local problems could quickly become global catastrophes, but also that global challenges required coordinated responses. The survivors of the Black Death learned to think differently about risk, uncertainty, and the future. They developed new institutions, insurance companies, public health systems, professional armies, designed to provide security in an uncertain world. They created new forms of art and literature that grappled with mortality and meaning. They built new economic systems that could adapt to rapid change and demographic upheaval. Perhaps most importantly, the plague survivors learned that human civilization, while fragile, was also remarkably adaptable. The same species that had created the conditions for the pandemic's spread had also found ways to survive, recover, and ultimately thrive. The Black Death had tested humanity's limits and found that those limits were far more expansive than anyone had imagined. As we face our own global challenges in the 21st century, climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruption, social inequality, the lessons of the Black Death remain startlingly relevant. Like our medieval ancestors, we live in an interconnected world where local problems can quickly become global crises. Like them, we must grapple with the limitations of traditional authorities and the need for new forms of knowledge and governance. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2019, reminded us that infectious diseases remain a threat to human civilization. While modern medicine and public health systems prevented the kind of catastrophic mortality seen during the Black Death, the pandemic still disrupted global trade, challenged political institutions, and forced societies to adapt rapidly to new realities. The parallels are striking. The spread of disease along global trade networks, the initial failure of traditional authorities to respond effectively, the development of new technologies and practices to combat the threat, and the unequal impact on different social groups. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us that we are not as far removed from our medieval ancestors as we might like to believe. But the differences are equally important. Modern science allowed us to identify the pathogen, understand its transmission mechanisms, and develop effective vaccines in record time. Global communication systems enabled rapid sharing of information and coordination of responses. International institutions, however imperfect, provided frameworks for cooperation and mutual support. The Black Death had taken years to spread across continents and decades to run its course. COVID-19 spread around the world in months and was brought under control, though not eliminated, within a few years. This acceleration reflects both the increased connectivity of our modern world and our enhanced capacity to respond to global challenges. Yet the fundamental lessons remain the same. Human civilization is both more fragile and more resilient than we often imagine. Our greatest achievements can be threatened by forces beyond our immediate control, but our capacity for adaptation, innovation, and renewal is also greater than we often realize. The Black Death reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that civilization is not guaranteed, and that the institutions and values we cherish must be actively defended and continuously renewed. But it also reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when faced with extraordinary challenges. The survivors of the Black Death rebuilt their world not by returning to what had existed before, but by creating something new and better. They used the crisis as an opportunity to question old assumptions, develop new institutions, and explore new possibilities. In doing so, they laid the foundations for the modern world, with all its achievements and continuing potential. As we face our own challenges, we would do well to remember their example. The Black Death had been humanity's darkest hour, but it had also been a catalyst for some of our greatest achievements. The plague that had wiped out half of humanity had also, in the end, helped create the world we inhabit today. A world shaped by catastrophe, but also by the human spirit's remarkable ability to rise from the ashes and build something new. The darkness has been explored. The lessons have been revealed. Now it's up to us to ensure that the wisdom gained from humanity's greatest catastrophe illuminates the path toward a more resilient, more just, and more hopeful future. The Black Death may have ended more than 6 centuries ago, but its most important lesson remains as relevant today as it was then. That even in our darkest hours, the human spirit endures, adapts, and ultimately prevails. The plague that wiped out half of humanity had also, paradoxically, helped create the conditions for humanity's greatest flourishing. From the ashes of the medieval world had risen the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. The greatest catastrophe in human history had also been, in many ways, humanity's greatest opportunity for renewal and growth. As we close this exploration of humanity's encounter with the Black Death, we carry with us both a sobering awareness of our vulnerability and an inspiring recognition of our resilience. The plague had taught our ancestors that the world could change completely in just a few years, that certainties could become uncertainties overnight, and that survival required not just individual strength, but collective wisdom and cooperation. These lessons echo across the centuries, reminding us that we are part of a long human story of challenge and response, catastrophe and renewal, death and rebirth. The Black Death had been a chapter in that story, a dark chapter, but not the final one. The story continues, and it's up to us to write the next chapters with the wisdom gained from those who came before us. The plague that wiped out half of humanity had also revealed the other half's extraordinary capacity for survival, adaptation, and renewal. In the end, that may be the Black Death's most important legacy, not the reminder of how much we can lose, but the demonstration of how much we can overcome.